Agradecendo a presença de todos, a participação dos meus colegas do grupo de tradução que está todo aqui, que é o professor Francisco, o professor Orison, a professora Jennifer, a Marcela, a Adriana, o professor Jean-François, que é recém-chegado na casa, e o professor José Roberto, que não sei se vocês se lembram, em junho ele estava aqui fazendo uma oficina conosco também, veio nos prestigiar mais uma vez, tá? Então, sem delongas, eu passo a palavra ao professor José Roberto, que vai proferir em inglês a conferência, tá?
Muito obrigado, professora Katia. É prazer chegar em Natal. Para muita gente no meu país, Natal é uma cidade na África do Sul. Mas Benaki zero. I feel very honored and I thank Professor Katia. I thank also my excellent student from a few years ago and colleague now, Jean-François. I'm very happy, first of all, to work in Brazil. And I have been in contact with Brazil, no details at this moment. And I have been in a few places, almost every time in relation with translation problems. In fact, the discovery of what you call the Nordest is a recent discovery. So Fortaleza is very new for me, Natal very different. What I have seen in a few hours is splendid, and it looks like a young university. Thank you for inviting me. I am always excited when new partners ask questions about translation issues. In the entire program, condensed program that we have in front of us, in the entire program, I shall try to demonstrate all the time that translation is a fascinating phenomenon, which in fact we don't really know. I speak as a scholar, but we don't really know it well, and this may be a good reason. It's a challenge for any university worldwide. Universities still have to discover translation. I tried to demonstrate this, but it's fascinating from our individual point of view. And in fact, this is how I have discovered translation studies and translation. These are very different things. And I shall try to demonstrate all the time that, in fact, the reason for taking part in activities in relation with translation, the main reason is much less what we are really interested in. I think that as staff members or students or intellectuals linked with universities, we have to insist on the fact that the first community that needs to deal with translation from our perspective is university. Universities have not yet discovered translation studies, and when they translation, and when they deal with it, when they focus on it, in general they do it a little bit, as most universities do. I mean, in a bureaucratic way. Linguistics or medicine, that's for the medical staff. or for linguists. The responsibilities in relation with translation are tremendous, especially in our contemporary world. And after all, I must even confess, as a scholar, and I have done quite a few things in order to start up a new discipline. In fact, that perspective hardly pops up in contemporary research, which means, after all, this is a beautiful challenge. So we have a full new world to discover. After all, what else can we wish as members of universities? Wonderful, there must be a future. No, we do not yet need our schedule. The first thing I try to do is demonstrating in a few moments. I shall go for something like 1 hour, 15 minutes, which is heavy even for young people like you. And then we'll see what kind of interaction there can be taking place. By the way, my knowledge of Portuguese is, I would say, is a little bit ambiguous for many reasons. And in order to make you feel at ease, I'll tell you, falo bem, mas não entendo nada. Which may be a well-known situation in communication matters. But the first discovery procedure that I would like to submit is this. It's an exercise. I have often worked this out with students and colleagues, and the text is available. There are lots of texts that I am going to mention. I have the references. The text has been published in one of the languages that I don't speak, but I understand it, and I mean Spanish. It's an article about this question. Now, my question to you, and I would like to listen to you. You use one of the languages that you are used to hear and to work in. My question is this. This very day, today, at which moment and how did you enter in contact with translation matters? What I try to demonstrate is translation is not something that exists in the books, maybe at universities, and that a few professionals are living in. Translation is part of my own life, and I'm sure it's part of your life. But let's check a little bit. So, lend me your ears, but I'm using my ears. So how can you illustrate that in this very particular society, I insist on that, in this very particular society, you can't live until, say, 10:30 in the morning without having dealt with translation. I shut up for a while. As they say in French, la balle est dans votre camp. You are very welcome.
Maybe they don't understand the question. Hey, my students. Do you understand the question? No, they don't understand the question. So the question is, how did you enter into contact with translation? And in your social life, like we were talking about this morning, right? We were saying, okay, some people have already done some translation for particular purposes in social practices online. For example, some of my students are very interested in series, and so they do subtitling because the subtitles that they were reading were horrible, and so they're like, I can do this better. So there's a whole culture of amateur subtitlers that came into contact through this social practice. I'm speaking for you, Maria. You should be saying this yourself. But so I think that's the question.
Yes.
You want to answer?
No, that's pretty.
Thank you very much. I'll make my question a little bit more explicit.
Okay.
Did you already produce any translation today?
Yes.
Today?
Yes.
Today? This very day.
In a class situation, right?
Yes. Yes.
For professional reasons?
Not yet today.
Oh, okay. Did you hear any messages in Natal today in which translation was used? Who among you has attended any news report today? In general, we do that in the evening, but there are people who are maniacs of news. So the maniacs among you, what kind of contact did you have with the news? And where was translation? Help me, it's clear that's it. Oh, yeah.
But I mean, maybe on Facebook, since there are some news there, right?
Okay. Excellent example. And I would say you did not get in touch with one single translation, even on Facebook. But that's an ambiguous, interesting case because, of course, it's full of English. Not only, well, maybe that's a perception that the non-Latin Americans have. That's another question. But Facebook is full of multilingualism. Later, I'm going to demonstrate that wherever there is lingua franca, wherever there is multilingualism, there is not only translation, but there are different translation policies. There's no language policy without a translation policy. Universities propose a fragmented world to scholarship. Are you a linguist? Oh no, you are rather in, say, in didactics. So, either or, one or the other. Where is university after all? These things are mixed in the real life. Okay, news, Facebook. Who was listening to the radio, news report, and so on? Where is translation in the news reports on the radio or on television?
When they are quoting someone's speech, for example, if they're talking about the U.S. president, they will quote what he said. So this is a translation.
And they even use, you are referring to a particular technique that is used in most television programs and on the internet. You all know the technique, you probably know the concept that is used by experts. when a certain American president is quoted, which happens, he's quoted all the time, in order to show to the audience that they don't manipulate this discourse, the first thing you hear and you see is Donald Trump talking English or American English, one or two sentences, and then his voice disappears. And at the end, in order to show that they have listened to the full speech by Donald Trump, the last sentences of the last words again are given to Donald Trump himself. In between that, what do you have? And the full procedure is called voiceover. There's hardly any research about it. I supervised a thesis on voiceover, and it was a thesis by a Brazilian student who is now a colleague of yours. So voiceover is one of the contacts, but we forget about it. You have already mentioned subtitling and dubbing and so on, but it's not only there. You can't open your newspaper without crossing texts that have been translated. I know how audiences like yours react when someone asks this, I would say, this very simple question: where did we meet translation phenomena today until 10:30? So you shut up because, oh, it's so obvious. But it's also very obvious that we were not really struck by it. Now I get to one of the problems of translation as a phenomenon, that is, it's not very visible. And it's not by hazard that it's not very visible. And translation scholars have written a lot about the invisibility of translation, but it's still much more complex than what has been discussed. Because, and here I'm going to stop this short introduction, the more we move on into modern culture, the more we get into what is called nowadays the circulation of communication. There's a continuous flow. The more we have this phenomenon, so current discourse, not only text, separated texts, but discourses going on like on Facebook and so on, the more we move into that kind of cultural activities, the more translated texts are mixed up with so-called non-translated discourse, even what we call normal discourse. Does this mean that this has not been translated? About what kind of discourses could we say this is not at all the result of translation? So translation is part of fragmented discourses. How does this work, and what can one learn about this? If this is not an issue for universities, why the devil would we have universities? So the internationalization of discourse implies the widening of the sources, the techniques, the channels, and so on, which means that we have much more arguments for focusing on that kind of phenomena. Now this is interesting for scholars, but I would say for business companies, for universities, for news stations, and for any kind of new president in a more or less important society. So how important is translation? Say, well, I don't like to talk all the time about Donald Trump, but you must have noticed that there was something like a secret contact between a certain Putin and a certain Trump, and the only witness was one translator. So how would our work function without translators? But translation is more than translators, and so on. Well, this has hardly been explored at all in research on translation. But okay, we could call this a captatio benevolentiae. It means, after all, maybe there's more to be discovered than okay. Is this really new? After discussing very shortly this, I'm going to show how a new discipline has been established, and it has lots of difficulties, but it has very strong arguments, and I'm convinced it has a strong future. But why do we notice this in 2017? Has this been noticed before? It has been said. What has happened only very recently is what we call the institutionalization of the discipline. And it's still very young and very weak. So it may be a responsibility of ours to take part in that. But first, a few words about the prehistory. I don't like scholars who insist heavily on the prehistory of their discipline, because this means before I have opened my mouth, nothing important has been said. That's prehistory. But there is an interesting and fascinating prehistory of translation studies. A colleague of mine, a well-known big name, Daniel Gilles from France, this must be going. Thank you.
It doesn't show up. Everybody knows has a video.
The invisibility of translation. Multicolored and multilingual communication. There's an interesting article by Daniel Gilles. Daniel Gilles is one of the big experts in research on interpreting. He published an article on the institutionalization of the discipline. He started by saying the translation phenomenon is quite old. It has been institutionalized since quite some time. But translation studies, systematic research on translation on the basis of programs, this is a very young phenomenon. How comes? Now, a few words about that prehistory, because it exists until this very day. Many people talk about Babel and so sorry. Babel, and after Babel. This means that there are several books about this. It's since the Garden of Eden that translation phenomena are part of social life, not simply of languages. And, of course, by definition, the beginning of translation was oral. Many of you may know that in German the word used for references to interpreting is dolmetschen. Der Dolmetscher. The origin is very clearly from Arabic, in the Arabic culture. In the Babel period, oral communication was part of the game. This has not disappeared at all. I know countries where translation is left to kids. Multilingual kids. This is called by experts nowadays natural translation. In general, in our contemporary culture, translation phenomena have been organized and recognized by societies. This has become professions with different names and competition between these names, dubbing, subtitling, and now this has not disappeared after the end of the Garden of Eden. This continues nowadays. I know colleagues who translate for their neighbors in their big building in Antwerp. When given families receive a letter from friends and so on, they need oral or written or media-based translation. So societies have not really changed in everything. During history, up to the so-called after Babel period, means until now, many forms and formats of translation activities have been multiplied, have taken a role in society. Interesting discussions have taken place, and I would call these discussions, not as most among us called it in general. I try to avoid that concept. Many people speak about, oh well, there is translation theory and there is translation practice. I would call this a too narrow view on the translation phenomenon, especially from the perspective of scholars. Because there is much more than this, and I would rather call this discourse on translation phenomena. And some discourse is more theory-oriented, linked with particular theories and so on. I'm not going to give any names, it's full of names, and you can find that. I'll show you where you find in a short time a very good documentation on this. These theories and this kind of communication has been multiplying, has been transformed little by little into sometimes over-organized worlds. Think of the European Union, even Canada, and so on. And in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, there was something like the beginning of a research-oriented approach to translation, I still do not call this translation studies. You will see why. But these theories have had an impact on translation studies. What kind of a that's for later and for other circumstances. Now, among such theories and such theoretical developments, most influential moments developed in the so-called Western world, even in Europe. Nowadays, on the internet, you will read that it's mainly in Western Europe and even in North America. I disagree. It's so much more complex. The real origins of translation studies are in Central Europe and in Russia. And one of the very beautiful books I'm going to react against the tendency to study translation on the basis of 2 or 3 books and of commercial promotion that you find on the internet. But there's one book at least that I would like to recommend. It's a book written by a Czech scholar. The first version of the book is from 1963. Jiří Levy. 63, it has been translated into German, and since a few years, very few years, it's available in English, and it's available in a very impressive series published by Benjamin's Translation Library, The Art of Translation and so on. Very rich book which confirms what we all borrowed from rather Central and Eastern Europe, and not only one country. But what is more important, and now I would like to get into, say, a little bit more traditional academic discussions about translation, and I would be happy if we couldn't from now on follow a little bit the historical development in the birth of translation studies. I'm even going to shorten very radically what I call translation training. It's very interesting to see how the important initiatives on the world level, but of course a little bit more in the Western world, have been taken not by universities, but by, say, society, even by business society and by political society. And the beginning of the installment of the professional training of translators can be located in history around the Second World War. And say, well, there were a few business companies and they even invested heavily, the business world, in machine translation. They were convinced that the translation problem was going to be solved from the moment they had solved the problem of languages and moving from one language to the other. So the mechanical approach, if you can say, I don't criticize them, but you know that Siemens, IBM, and so on have been heavily involved. European Union invested heavily. One day, one of the important people from the European Union, after the big years of the so-called machine translation, it survives well now, but under different names. So machine translation is not dead, but this representative of the European Union said, well, if the European Union were really serious, they would put into prison the people who are responsible for the investment in machine translation. They invested so heavily. Now, what kind of results? More than what this gentleman said, but okay. Translation training is obviously one of the illustrations of the replies on behalf of society to the translation interpretation challenges. But it's about business, and they were not accepted by universities. Let's notice that through history, several times universities have declined the possibility to introduce translation to university. Why? Probably because the pragmatic goals were too obvious. It was about money, and university said, oh, well, this is a service. It's in legislation, good lawyers and judges talk about translation only from the moment there are difficulties. And what they say in general is, oh, well, the translator obviously didn't know his job, or he could not solve.